Hey guys, I am a Portuguese history, and today we're going to be talking about Portuguese imperialism or colonization, specifically their presence in the 20th century. Now, if you're not Portuguese or you weren't raised in a Portuguese household or under their education system, you likely don't know much about their history of colonization. It's often overlooked, at least in the American education system. But I'm here to tell you a few things about it and why you should care about it. So Portugal was actually the first European country to go out and colonize a bunch of pre-existing either countries or just territories, as they colonized southern Africa and sort of western Africa while they were looking for a transoceanic trade route to Eastern Asia. And many people also don't really realize just how late in the game that they stopped colonizing or stopped, their imperialism, stopped having control over these colonies, because they only they only gave freedom to Timor, I think, in 1976. So that was just 48 years ago at the time of me making this video. So my point is, they have a really large hand in the colonization of both Africa and South America and some Atlantic and Pacific islands as well. And it's often overlooked when it's compared to Spain and England. So I'm just gonna go into a deep dive a little bit more about their actual presence and their policies and effects in these colonies during the 20th century. So let's start off with some of the basic policies that the Portuguese government placed on their overseas provinces during this time period. And I say overseas provinces because that's the name that the government had given them at the time. So their dictator at the time, some people like to say dictator, some people just say their leader, but the man in charge was Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, and many people just say Salazar. But he, without getting too much into the political aspect of it, because even now he's still, having died 50 something years ago, he's still heavily talked about and he's still pretty controversial. So without getting too far into it, he renamed the Portuguese colonies as overseas provinces, so he could basically escape the ridicule, international ridicule, and almost look established at the same time, because at around the same time, Belgium was, they had a colonial presence in the Congo, and the international community was kind of getting up in arms because the stuff down there was pretty bad. So he was trying to escape stuff like that with just naming it overseas provinces so people wouldn't really see it as the same thing. But these overseas provinces were they were really just colonies. I mean, the government instilled basically a caste system based on race. So you would either be called an indígena or não indígena, which is indigenous or not indigenous, where the indígenas basically didn't have the same human rights as the non-indigenous people, the Europeans, and they're often forced to do labor, basically slave labor, even though Portugal had made slavery illegal in their colonies almost 100 years prior to this happening. Salazar and his administration also created like Roman Catholic run churches, whose goal was basically to promote the Roman Catholic religion, um, create a very dumb workforce that was also like indoctrinated in the beliefs and loyalties towards like the fatherland, towards Portugal. But after the ousting of Salazar in 1968, it kind of led to an accelerated independence of their overseas provinces. And Timor was actually the last one to gain independence in 1976, which marked the end of Portuguese colonization. But this is not the end of the story. The whole point of me speaking about this is not just like shedding light about what happened, but also about how the policies, the effects of their economy, like social issues, how that in many places like still pertains to this day. So almost all ex-colonies or like countries that were previous colonies of Portugal have really struggled to come back from the situation that Portugal had left them in. And I'm just going to try to provide a couple of examples, although one of them is positive. So the first one is Cabo Verde, and Cabo Verde is the positive example in that it's very unique, which probably led to it being one of the only ones that actually got to highly succeed, at least on its own, because Cabo Verde is an island. It's a very small island in, like, off the coast of, I believe it's the western coast of Africa, and it was uninhabited before Portuguese explorers came in. So it was both Portuguese explorers and African slaves who were imported from the coasts of Africa that make up their demographic, that make up the ethnic group on that island. And that hasn't really changed for the few hundred years that Cabo Verde has been an island. So in terms of like creating how Portugal created like a racial caste system in many of the countries, that wasn't super apparent in Cabo Verde, and excuse me, and it certainly like would not continue to happen under their like new government once they got like freedom from Portugal. So that wasn't really an issue, like a social issue. And then in terms of education, which was a problem, and like welfare, basically, those were some of the biggest issues, not just there, but in almost every country that was like being run by Portugal. And when they were like given their independence, their government at the time basically said that we are going to prioritize these two things, as well as a couple other things, but these are the two main things because one, they're extremely important, but two, they were like the least prioritized under Portuguese rule. And if you look at the country to this day, it is in really, really good shape. But that's not really the case for a lot of other countries, and Angola is an example of one of those. And it kind of came as like a surprise because Angola under Portugal was like, it was like their diamond in the rough. Like it was like, it bolstered their economy so much. I mean, they literally, part of what made up their economy is diamonds and like basically a bunch of other imports that are native, or not necessarily native, but a lot easier to find in Africa. But these like commodities would only be held up in the like larger like 1% basically of Africa. And guess what? At that time, that was basically the wealthy elite who were Portuguese. So basically no indigenous people or like these people really had any sort of control, um, like economic control at least. And then when it came to those social issues that I was talking about earlier, like with the caste system, it was apparent there, because Angola was made up of a bunch of different like tribes and religions and languages, and all those mixing together, plus the Portuguese immigrants. And there were other immigrants too from other places in Europe, because mind you, this was happening in the 20th century, so it's not like mid to late 20th century, so it's not like this wasn't like you had to go on a horse and wagon. Like you could very easily fly there to start a new life. So all of this was going on. It really made the situation harder for those indigenous people, as well as the fact that the Portuguese government was basically trying to cram the language of Portuguese down their throats as much as they didn't want to do it. They would not allow the teaching of indigenous languages. Although, one good thing to know is that today in Angola, Portuguese is one of the least spoken languages in their whole country. Just because, despite all that, people still found that they were still trying to teach their languages to their kids without school, which I find pretty cool. But at least in an economic standpoint, after Portugal left, they were no longer able to keep up Angola's economy, because it was basically artificially kept up through selling a lot of goods at artificially low prices. So their market pretty much crashed, and then that led to a bunch of communist revolutions and governments, and it's kind of just been in a state of I don't know, we don't really know where we're going to go from here. And the stuff that's happening in Angola is basically it's like a larger example for the rest of other Portuguese ex-colonies, because some of them have it worse, but ultimately I think it's a pretty good example of that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. It's kind of supposed to be a summary of, I guess, events, and it's not really supposed to be a complete timeline of things. If it was, it would be a lot longer. I did make a research paper that goes into greater detail about this, and it also lists its sources under that paper. Those are the sources that I used in that paper, as well as the sources that I've used for this video. So I'll just have that linked in my description, and I'll see you guys next time.